Welcome to Novelist Spotlight. This is Mike Consul, your host. In addition to being the host of this podcast and interviewing novelists, I am a novelist myself. I have 3 published novels. My latest is titled Lolita Firestone, a supernatural novel, and it is set in Sedona, Arizona and Cairo, Egypt. My previous novel is titled Family Recipes, a novel about Italian culture, Catholic guilt, and the culinary crime of the century. And my first novel is named Hardwood, a novel about college basketball and other games young men play. And that story deals with issues ranging from depression and racism to sex, religion, and university politics. All 3 novels are listed in the episode notes. I hope you will buy them, I hope you will read them, and I hope you will thoroughly enjoy them. Now, on with our program. In the spotlight is the great John Updike and James Schiff, who has documented much of the great author's work over the years. James Schiff was born and raised in Cincinnati. He received his bachelor's degree at Duke University and his master's and PhD at NYU. He's the author or editor of 5 books on contemporary American fiction, including John Updike Revisited, Updike's Version, Rewriting the Scarlet Letter, and Updike in Cincinnati. He was named by the John H. Updike Literary Trust to edit a volume of Updike's letters. He reviews books for newspapers, magazines, and journals, and serves as editor of the John Updike Review. Obviously well suited to this discussion. James Schiff, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Mike. It's good to be here.
It's good to have you. What attracted you to John Updike's work from the start?
That's a good question. And I think for me, it was, I grew up in I guess what you would call middle America, and never thought it was particularly interesting. I kind of was drawn to other places, whether it was New York or Europe or a variety of places. But I think until I read Updike, I don't think I fully understood what an interesting and even mysterious at times world it was that I had grown up in. And so I think in a way he was a kind of a lens that helped me understand what was of interest and value with the mundane, with the quotidian life. And so that kind of got me started with him. And I think he was he's so adept at writing about the quotidian, and he's also such a great craftsman with language, has amazing facility with language, to the point that you sometimes think he has more than 5 senses. There was a reviewer who wrote about one of his early novels that Updike seems to be writing with 6 or 7 senses. So I think it was that interest in the mundane, but also that ability to write sentences that nobody else could seemingly write.
That is a great point that you bring up this, what appears to be kind of dull life, everyday life, which is kind of boring. We look for the highlights in life, but John Updike has been, he writes beautifully about it, but he also has been criticized as writing beautifully about nothing. So when you talk about the quotidian, a lot of people think in terms of, okay, well, nothing's really happening here. And yet Updike has got these insights, and he crafts the language in a way that makes it all, I sees through it in a way that other people do not. What about that criticism, though? That's one of a few criticisms, is that he writes beautifully about nothing. He dawdles, but he also writes about ordinary people. I mean, I want to make that point. The fact that he doesn't write about Tom Wolfe wrote about Masters of the Universe and about big time real estate developers and so on. Updike was very happy with the everyday people who are not who are fairly ordinary. But getting back to that core question about writing beautifully about nothing. I mean, what do you think about that criticism? What would your rejoinder be?
Yeah, I guess, John Aldridge was the one who first leveled it. And I always thought, in terms of his criticism, he was more interested in I don't maybe trying to control readers' reactions to certain writers and maybe writers that he wasn't happy with for whatever reason, that he would then somehow try and score a kind of uh, I don't know, a blow to that writer. But I think it's up to readers to kind of figure out if he does have something to say. And I think, I can only speak personally. For me, he's had a great deal to say, and I think nowhere is that seen better than in the Rabbit novels, the four Rabbit novels, and then the novella Rabbit Remembered, which basically comes out to about 1,800 pages of writing about a single character. And even though there is there's some real, significant events that happen in the first couple of novels, there's largely an attempt on Updike's part to document what it's like to be this character, Rabbit Angstrom, and to be alive in America during these particular decades about which he writes. And I find those novels absolutely fascinating. And I think Updike, in a way, has done maybe what Thoreau did with nature, where he kind of he essentially in the way that Thoreau would wrote about Walden Pond and nature, it was Updike really, through his watchfulness, his precise description and intelligence, and his eloquent prose, he bestows a kind of vibrancy and meaning on the everyday. And again, I guess you could have said the same thing about Thoreau with nature and with Walden, that he's just writing about, being in the woods and looking at a pond. I think it's best for every writer or for every reader to make that decision for him or herself and look at the writing and see if it's compelling or not.
Well, the facility you mentioned, the facility of his writing. There's nobody I've ever read who's got more command over the language. You can quibble with what he's writing about or his take on it, but just his sheer writing ability is just marvelous. I've never read anybody whose writing is any better than his, just in terms of his command of the language. Now, you mentioned the Rabbit series. Those two Pulitzer Prizes came out of that, is my recollection correct?
Yes, for the latter two novels, Rabbit is Rich and Rabbit at Rest.
So he's a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner. I mean, he's been decorated with a lot of awards. Um, there, he also had the novel Couples, which was kind of a timepiece. A lot of his stuff, I think, are timepieces. It was the 60s. He came out with a sexually frank novel called Couples. He says, well, I wasn't the only one at the time. There was a couple other authors who came. Well, the lead came out from Nabokov, Vladimir Nabokov, and I'm forgetting the other one, but there was another novel at the time. But he made a lot of waves with Couples, and I don't recall whether there were actual key parties in there or not. But it was a sexually frank book. And one of the other criticisms of John Updike, although this has been leveled at a lot of male authors, is that there's just sexism and misogyny contained within. I never got that, but what do you say about that?
Yeah, well, actually, the most recent issue of the John Updike Review has a section on this by about 6 different writers. So again, it's something that every writer is going to respond to, and I think Updike, as a writer who was born, in the Depression era and grew up in the 40s and the 50s, does have a perspective on sex and on gender and on that to many contemporary readers might at times seem old-fashioned or of a different era. And so I think with any writer that you're reading, whether it's Hemingway or Flaubert or any writer, Virginia Woolf, the writers of their time, and certain things that they're going to say are going to reflect that time period. And those of us who come along a generation or a century later, might diminish their diminish their success or their abilities because they see the world somewhat differently. But I think that's fairly typical with literature. So, but I do think Updike was very candid and wanted to be candid in regard to writing about sex and regarding about in his case mostly heterosexual relationships. And because of that, there are going to be passages that could be offensive. I mean, I'll give you a good example. When Rabbit Run, Updike finished Rabbit Run in December of 1959, and his wife at the time, Mary, asked him to send the manuscript to a local minister, Goldie Sherrill, who was a good friend of Updike's. And the reason Mary wanted him to send that manuscript there was to see if Goldie would be offended by any of the scenes between Rabbit and a Reverend Eccles in Rabbit Run. And Goldie's response, which came a little bit later, was that he was fine with any of those episodes between Rabbit and Reverend Eccles, but he was horrified by the book. And how can you write this kind of book? And then months later, Alfred Knopf's lawyers went through the novel and really insisted that there needed to be some changes, particularly with some of the sexual talk. And then finally, months later, when Updike's mother-in-law read the novel, she also was horrified. And how could you create this character of Rabbit, and how could you do this? And so I think Updike was under a lot of pressure there. He had a good friend who was a minister. He had attorneys, and he had his mother-in-law who were all rather upset with the book. And I think, as we've seen, Rabbit Run, went on to be one of the most successful, post-war novels in American literature. And so I think Updike had this feeling that what he was doing was important, but he was very much aware that the writing would offend people, sometimes for the sexuality, and other times for the nature of his characters. And in that case, Rabbit Angstrom is behaving rather selfishly and self-indulgently and not being punished for it. And some readers didn't like that. So I think I mean the readers will at times be upset or offended by what Updike writes. And I think Updike's response, if he were here, would just say he is trying to depict his sense of the way that things really happen and appear.
Yeah, and I think you'd agree, Jim, that he was never lurid in his writing. When he was writing about sex or sexuality, it was almost invariably suggestive. He gave you kind of a gesture drawing of it, and you kind of filled in the blanks. So it was never a highly sexual. I mean, I think of it as very tame by today's standards.
Well, and that's if you went back and looked at Rabbit Run, and then the bits that Updike had to remove for that first edition with Knopf by I don't know, it was the mid to late 60s, he was able to return those passages. And that novel seems very innocuous in terms of its sexuality. And I mean, very mild by today's standards. I do think Updike, in his writing about sexuality, could often be very visual and at times detailed, and that might surprise some readers. But I think if you look at the way he describes, pretty much the way he describes somebody sitting in a room and what's in the room, or the way that he describes being in a car and driving. He's a very visual writer and a very detailed writer. There are certain writers like somebody like Roth, who I think of as more of an oral writer, as a writer that you hear and you hear the sound of. But Updike was trained as was very interested in being an artist, being a visual artist, being a cartoonist, and he even had a year of art school in Oxford, in England. And so he's very visually attuned writing. So sometimes you will see when it comes to a scene of two people having sex of tremendous visual detail. But I think Updike would say he's giving it the same attention that he would give anything else. And I think that's pretty much accurate.
Yeah. You mentioned that's part of what's amazing about his first love was art, is my understanding, and yet he ends up being a writer and an incredibly gifted writer. The guy had a lot of talents. Um, and I want to get to the art part in a little bit, but you mentioned Philip Roth. And one of the things Philip Roth said is that, no matter how long you write, no matter how old you get, it's still a struggle to write. He said, except for maybe John Updike. And that totally resonated with me because, and I think he was being a little bit facetious, but when I read Updike, it looks effortless. It's like this is so easy. It just flows from him. It doesn't look like he ever struggles to find a sentence. And so often when I'm reading a novel, there are certain sections of novels, just certain sentences where it just feels like the author struggled with it or that it's a bit tortured. And you just don't get that from Updike. It all seems so effortless. Do you know, I'm sure it wasn't, just because the nature of writing is difficult, but I did hear him say in an old interview that, a short story is 7 to 10 days. That's a pretty short time frame for him to produce a short story. Um, what do you know about his writing routine and how much effort was involved or how effortless it might have been?
Yeah, no, that also is a really good question, and I think for the rest of us who are mere mortals, it does it does seem at times how does a human being do this exactly? And I do think he had tremendous gifts, and I think I mean you can look at it and you'd say, well, he had his first acceptance in the New Yorker for a poem when he was 22, and then a few weeks later had an acceptance for a short story. And after that, he ended up publishing 800 pieces in the New Yorker and a total of about 2,000 pieces in all the different journals and newspapers he published and 65 books. And so it does seem as if it came rather easily. But I think there's another side to this, which is that Updike had been he had been sending out drawings and cartoons and poems and all sorts of pieces to magazines, including the New Yorker, from the time he was 13 years old. And by the time he had that first acceptance at the New Yorker when he was 22, he had accumulated hundreds of rejection slips. So, and he also had a mother who was an aspiring writer who went to Cornell in the 1920s to get a master's in English literature, and very much was trying to publish her stories. And John had once told me that from about the time he was 8 years old, he was the youngest unpaid editor in American literary history. That he was reading her manuscripts, and her manuscripts were, generally coming back with a rejection. So he was very much involved in the writing world and writing business through his observation of what his mother was trying to do. And he also then began sending out as I said, his artwork, but also his writing at a very young age. And he did have tremendous success in placing his material in a high school newspaper, and then at the Harvard Lampoon. He was prolific, perhaps more prolific than anyone there in terms of his drawings, his cartoons, his poems, his short stories, and so on that then appeared in the magazine. So he had a long apprenticeship really till he got placed in the New Yorker. But I think he did have tremendous gifts, and and you had mentioned how fast he wrote a short story. I mean, there's a period actually right after he finishes Rabbit Run in January of 1960. He and his family, he and his wife Mary and their 4 children go to Anguilla for a 5-week vacation. And in his letters, he talks about, being at the beach with the kids and doing this and that and exploring the island. And yet during that same 5-week period, he wrote 4 short stories, including Pigeon Feathers, which is one of his best. And he wrote letters and he did all sorts of other things too. So I think he was somebody, most of the people who I know are writers, are really protective of their time and of their space. And I think you'll hear, I remember talking to John's children about this, and they said when he had an office in Ipswich in the 1960s, and they would go in to see him, they might have been at the beach or at school or wherever, and they came in, and he would immediately stop typing and talk to them and interact and be very fatherly and friendly. And then the second they left and they started going down the stairs, they would hear the clicking of typing. So he was able to kind of turn it on and off pretty quickly, but I think it was a very natural thing for him to do, and I got the sense that he needed to write in the way that a lot of us need to breathe and eat. It was something that he was constantly doing, and as I found through editing his letters the last few years, he wrote thousands and thousands of letters, and always needed to kind of express himself on paper.
Yeah, I mean, an absolutely charmed career, starting so early. You mentioned his mother had literary dreams. He said that because his mother wanted to be a writer, there were books everywhere. So he was immersed in the written word. You mentioned that he went to Harvard. What did he study at Harvard?
He ended up studying English. In the beginning he took he was a very good math student, and but that and his father had been a math teacher, but he and he did take a couple fine arts classes. In fact, that's where he met his wife Mary, who was a couple years older, was a senior at Radcliffe when he was a sophomore at Harvard. And he met her in a medieval arts class, and then I believe the semester after they took a drawing class. So he did take some, Updike said even though he read a great deal as a kid, a lot of it was mystery novels, and that he really did read his literature at Harvard, and that he worked pretty hard, particularly I think freshman year. Um, and he was also exposed to a great many teachers who were not only excellent teachers, but some teachers who were able to help him with his writing. And on several occasions, and it was interesting because he was rejected by, for instance, Archibald MacLeish on I think two occasions for his poetry workshop. He did find others in the English department who worked with him, and so he was able to write. He was able to attempt a first novel, I believe, during sophomore year, and then he was able to write short stories and then get feedback from his professors. And he found that very helpful, as did his mother, who in his correspondence with her, he would often share what he had learned from his professors.
Interesting. So he graduates from Harvard. He goes to London to do some art studies. What do you know about his time in London and with art?
Yeah, he actually went to Oxford.
Oh, Oxford. Okay.
Yeah, the Ruskin School of Fine Arts, and he basically got a fellowship, a Knox fellowship, um, and so that essentially gave him time to uh, it gave him time to uh, to draw and take classes, but it also gave him time to write and to live in a foreign country. Updike had grown up a kind of lower middle class kid, lived in Chillington till he was roughly about a teenager, and then moved to Plowville, where his mother went and purchased the farm on where she was born and grew up. And so he was kind of isolated in a farmhouse, which initially had no electricity or running water, and had family, a very intelligent, conversant family, but without economic means. So this travel to England and to Oxford was, and even his travel to, or his attending Harvard on a full scholarship was a big deal. That was, moving him out of Berks County, Pennsylvania. And I think in that year in England, the Updikes were Mary was pregnant with their first child, Elizabeth, who was born on April 1st of 55, and he also ended up writing and then publishing quite a few stories and poems, placing them with the New Yorker that year and developing a relationship with Catherine White, his first editor at the New Yorker, and then later Bill Maxwell. So I think it was an important time, probably gave him a kind of a confidence and worldliness in living outside of the country for, oh, I don't know, they were probably there for about 10 months. And then he kind of came back and had a job at the New Yorker if he wanted it, which he then took, and he ended up living in New York for the next year and a half as a talk of the town writer, where again he was very, very successful. And in addition to his talk of the town assignments, he would write stories and poems, and began a first novel.
Now, he didn't stay in New York. He ended up moving he was not a big city guy. Is that right, Jim? That it wasn't that he couldn't live. I mean, he did live in New York for what, several years, but he was more maybe a suburban Pennsylvania, Massachusetts sort of guy.
Yeah, that's true. And I think both he and Mary were very excited about coming to New York, after they left Oxford. And he had a good job with the New Yorker, and they lived on the Upper West Side initially, and then they lived in the Village on 13th Street. And so I think they initially were very excited about that. But I think after about a year and a half, they had another child. Their son David was born at that time. And so they needed more space. And I think, I think there was a feeling on Updike's part, maybe there were too many writers in New York. And maybe there was a feeling that nothing you could do would be seen as significant or important enough. And, he grew up in a small town, and really the time when he lived in Shillington, Pennsylvania, I think was very important and impactful in his life. So I think the idea of of going again to a small town, which is what he and Mary did. Then they moved in 1957 to Ipswich, Massachusetts, on the North Shore, and this is where they honeymooned. Mary's father was a minister, and I believe it was one of his parishioners had a cottage in Ipswich that the Updikes were able to use for a few days on their honeymoon. So I think it was a familiar place, and they went back there and they rented a house, and then eventually they bought a house. And Updike then ended up spending, the next nearly about 17 years or so, I guess, in Ipswich, and then found a real sense of belonging there with other couples and with other families. And there was a community. And I think it was a place where he felt comfortable in terms of having material to write about, in terms of this kind of quotidian, middling American kind of existence. I think he found small town life being very conducive in terms of providing that kind of material, where maybe New York didn't quite provide that in the same way.
So he was only 22 when he published his first story in the New Yorker. It was titled Friends from Philadelphia. What do you think about Updike's short story writing versus his novels? He's been hailed for both. What's the distinction between the two, other than the actual length?
Yeah, he was he was really adept at the form, and I think because he had practiced it so much and he had submitted so many pieces before he had again his first acceptance at the New Yorker. Um, and he, as you mentioned before, he was able to write these quickly. I mean, I've seen some of these stories. He writes in 4 or 5 days, and I think stories that took any longer than a couple of weeks were probably more unusual. But I think he's so good at the short form in terms of just knowing how it works, and particularly how to end a short story. And he could also, I think his vision too is he is interested in the small things. He's interested in the mundane that is often neglected. So that's the case with many of his stories, that they are about small kind of daily things. And I think sometimes when you think of that next to, the great writing of significant writers who write about, wars and grand love affairs and all sorts of things, his story about, something mundane happening, you might question it at first, and then you realize there's all sorts of moments of recognition, because that's what most of our lives are made up of, is those small daily events that do have meaning, and he's able to interpret them. He was really adept at taking um, things that would happen to him and turning it into fiction, and really remarkable at it. I think in the novels, what you see is, um, there's a difference, I guess, in the sense that the stories were written largely for the New Yorker, and the New Yorker, at least until the 1980s or so, had certain conventions, and there were certain kinds of language that you couldn't use. Updike using the word can to refer to a woman's rear end in 1960 was very problematic for William Shawn at the New Yorker. And what are they going to do with that word? And they're trying to figure this out. And what word could they replace it with, and so on. So there was a kind of a prudery, about a prudishness that was at the New, even though the New Yorker was, I think, largely seen, in the second half of the 20th century as being the premier, literary magazine, and I think still is. There was at that time still a kind of a prudishness. So Updike, what he wrote in his rabbit novels or couples, he wouldn't be able to write in a New Yorker story. So he almost had these different kind of modes where he would compartmentalize his writing. But in his writings, he's definitely looser, and there is a tightness in those short stories. But there's a looseness, and he's able to, as I said before, kind of talk about things that he couldn't talk about in a New Yorker story. I value both. I think, he worked in many genres. He was also an amazing critic, and I tend to think of his criticism and his story writing as perhaps maybe the very best of Updike. And I think his novels are all really good, and I think Rabbit is a major achievement, one of the major achievements of the second half of the 20th century. And his poetry is also very good, but I do think the stories are at times maybe Updike at his best.
You know, when Tom Wolfe decided, well, I'm going to write a novel, he had written some fabulously successful nonfiction books like Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test and The Right Stuff. Then he writes The Bonfire of the Vanities. And I don't know if you remember this, Jim, but Updike had said, it's entertaining, but it's not literature. It's not. And they had a little back and forth. Also, Norman Mailer went back and forth with Wolfe on stuff as well. What was it? Do you recall that the jawboning that went back and forth between Updike and Tom Wolfe, and why he looked at Bonfire of Vanities and said that's not literature. It's entertainment, but not literature.
Yeah, I mean, that review appeared in the New Yorker, and I guess, yeah, and I think Mailer, and then maybe
John
John
Irving.
Irving. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think they were the three who kind of went after Wolfe. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I read some Wolfe, particularly back in the 80s and 90s and so on. And I think Updike, I think maybe one of the things that had been a little annoying was when Wolfe came out with that literary manifesto, and I can't remember where it was, when it was published. It might have been in the 80s or 90s, but in his literary manifesto, and again, I haven't looked at it in years, but something to the point that this is the kind of writing that American writers should be doing now, and I'm the one doing it. It was a kind of a
A little
self-advertisement,
high-handed, yeah.
yeah, and so this is what we all should be doing, and and I think from Updike's sense of things, that was all a bit superficial. Wolfe was interested in what was kind of going on in culture at the moment, and so he was reflecting that, but that it was often about surfaces, and that there wasn't really a great deal of depth to his characters. And so I think there was a kind of a lightness that Updike perceived in it, that he then referred to as a kind of entertainment. And yeah, so I don't know. I think I think for Updike it wasn't really necessarily a big deal. He reviewed so many novels, so many books for the New Yorker. It was just kind of another reviewing assignment. But I think it really, I think it perturbed Wolf, and then there was kind of turned into a feud. But I don't know if Updike really participated in the feud too much, beyond his kind of dismissal of Wolf's novel, which I think maybe was A Man in Full at the time. I can't recall.
No, I
I
think
think
it was
that was Full.
Bonfire of the
I,
Vanities, I think.
I think it was Man because
Was it?
yeah, I'm pretty sure it was. I don't think he reviewed Bonfire, but he probably read it. But I think it was probably in the 90s, I'm thinking. So
Gotcha. Yeah.
yeah,
And I think you're right that he didn't engage in it a whole lot. Norman Mailer loved that stuff. So they went back and forth.
right,
Uh,
right.
so, so, I want to mention that one of the New Yorker editors had said that a lot of writers are defensive if you say, well, why don't you rethink this sentence or this passage right here? They're defensive about it. And he said John Updike would take it and turn it back over to you better than he had left it. He was not a defensive writer. He was a guy who would take a look at it, and if you feel like this could be improved, here I go, I'll improve it. But one of the other things that was said is that not by the same editor, but that, and I never really got this, but that John Updike had advertising language in his poetry and fiction, and he would use well-known brand names. What about advertising language? I mean, do you see that? I mean, I kind of missed it, but what if you do see it in there? What is the nature of that advertising writing? I'm not sure if they're saying, well, I'm not sure what they're saying. Maybe you have some insight on that, Jim.
Yeah, I'm not sure about advertising writing. I mean, I do think, you wouldn't see what I think you're talking about in his short stories. Maybe in some of the novels, like the Rabbit novels, he at times might catalog. Um, uh, I mean, a number of writers do. I mean, Whitman would catalog certain things in a poem. But I mean, Updike in some of the Rabbit novels might catalog what Rabbit is seeing as he drives on a street in what is modeled after, say, Reading, Pennsylvania. And so there might be a sense, and also as he's listening to the radio or as he's thinking about a song on the radio or what an announcer is saying, there might be a catalog of kind of cultural artifacts or things like that. I mean, there's a great scene in Rabbit is Rich where Rabbit is at a guest house and he's had a few drinks and he goes in to use the bathroom and it's probably, I don't know, it's probably a 3 or 4 page scene, and he mostly catalogs what's in the bathroom, but he does it through such incredible language and powers of perception. And then you also start really realizing in this novel about consumerism that he's showing all of the things that are in this guest bathroom that, as being a guest bathroom in itself, it's not really used very much, on the rare occasions when a guest comes. And so it's almost a kind of a critique of American culture and American consumerism. So I think there might be something like that. Maybe that's what
Mm.
was being alluded to. I do, but I don't find, yeah, the term of using advertising writing or something. I'm not sure if I know what it is exactly, but I don't see that in Updike. I mean, I think one of the criticisms of Updike at times that I think maybe does hold a bit more sway would be that, there's a kind of a professionalism at times where you almost feel, he's able to write about absolutely anything. I mean, I think it was Martin Amis who said that, he's a master of all trades, able to crank himself up to PhD level on, anything he fancies, whether it's architecture, topography, computers, evolution, whatever. And I think at times, because he does that, sometimes the writing seems so professional and polished that you somehow struggling maybe to find the emotional way into it. And so I think something closer to that seems truer to me. But I think the other thing with Updike, because he wrote so much that it's always easy in Updike to find a problematic line or a passage or a page or a character or something like that because there's so much there. And but no, I encourage people to go out and read it for themselves and to see, because I do think I think, and I've seen this with my students, both undergraduates and graduate students, is that they'll sometimes read a passage in Updike or they'll read a story and they'll be astonished. How did he do that exactly? And so he really did have a gift.
Yeah, no question. What's your favorite novel of his?
Oh gosh, it's hard to say, and I've read them so many times that I feel like I'm not not particularly useful in this sense. But I always had been attracted to Rabbit is Rich since it came out in 1981. I don't know, I was just graduating from college then, so I probably read it shortly thereafter. And I used to teach it some, and I liked teaching it because it's a novel where not very much happens. And yet it won, gosh, didn't it win the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize and maybe the National Book Critics Circle Award? It was, the much acclaimed novel, but it's a novel where, as I said, not much happens, and he makes that interesting. And I just thought that was astonishing how he was able to do that. At the same time, it's a novel that polarizes readers. I mean, when I used to teach that novel, I would have readers, maybe a third of my class would come in and say, that's the best novel I've ever read. I love it. And then another third would tell me that they hated it and they threw it at the wall and they were so angry at the character. So I used to enjoy that kind of polarized response. I'm not sure if I enjoy it as much today. Maybe the world's become a little too polarized, and so it's a novel that I'm not as eager to teach now. But I think it's a good one. I think the Rabbit novels, I think probably Updike stories are maybe the best thing to start with. But if you like those, then maybe turn to the Rabbit novels, and you can really jump in anywhere. Although some people tell me they like to start with the first one, which is Rabbit Run.
So his the creation of his lifetime was a character, Harry Rabbit Angstrom. And talk about the evolution of Rabbit Angstrom over the course of those four novels. He starts, he's a basketball player. Then what? Talk a little bit about the major maybe milestones over the course of those novels in the life of Rabbit Angstrom.
Yeah, we see the first Rabbit novel appear in 1960, and Rabbit at the time is 26 years old, and he's a salesman, and he's married, and has a child with another child on the way, and he was a high school basketball star, kind of the darling of the crowds, and there's very much a sense that his life peaked when he was 17 or 18, when he was a high school basketball star, and nothing since then has matched it. And he runs a lot in that novel, and he's trying to find something that takes him back to what he felt when he was a high school basketball star, and he struggles to find that, and he ends up and that story takes place over several months in his life. Then Updike, while he was struggling to write a novel about President James Buchanan, who in many ways was one of our lesser successful or least successful American presidents. He was the one who preceded Lincoln. Updike was having trouble writing that novel, so he turned back to Rabbit, and then 11 years later, 1971, it was either 70 or 71, publishes Rabbit Redux, where we see Rabbit 10 years later. And at that point, Rabbit is working, doing linotype for a newspaper. And it's the time of the U.S., the moonshot, sending men to the moon. And so this is a pattern that Updike would use with the Rabbit novels. He returns to Rabbit every 10 years and kind of picks up on Rabbit's life. In 1981, in Rabbit is Rich, Rabbit is now a car salesman working for his father-in-law in his father-in-law's business, and he's selling Toyotas. So he's in a pretty good place there. Because here's a guy who really had struggled in the first couple novels, and now he's doing well because everybody wants to buy Toyotas. And then finally at Rabbit at Rest, we see him 10 years later. moving toward retirement. And then Rabbit Remembered is a novella that Updike picks up later in 2000. So these 5 books about Rabbit really, turned Rabbit into this kind of American icon where he's a little bit like a Huck Finn or a Jay Gatsby or a Hester Prynne, where he is he's this kind of mythical protagonist who's familiar from just a single moniker, in the way that Huck or Gatsby is. We think of just of Rabbit. His full name is Harry Rabbit Angstrom. But I think it's not only a story about Harry, but it's a story about the country. And so we see, as Updike wrote these novels between 1959 and about the year 2000, we see the country change and in many ways erode, diminish, and Updike is chronicling that. And there's also this sense, I think, what was, I had a graduate student in a class a few years ago who, when she read Rabbit is Rich, she was kind of upset about the character, but she said, I've never seen a writer create a human being on the page in the way that Updike has, where he seems real. He seems larger than life in terms of the detail. And so I think there was a sense that Rabbit, in between the publication of these novels every 10 years, it's almost as if he existed outside of the text, and he continued to age and the country continued to age. And to the point that really, when we get to the end of Rabbit at Rest and we have the end of Rabbit's life, both the New York Times and the Washington Post addressed the end of Rabbit and his life, not only in their book review section, but on their editorial pages. And they essentially wrote obituaries to Rabbit. And so he very much gave the sense that he was this living creature. And he, if people haven't read the novels, he's kind of an interesting figure in that he's optimistic. He's somewhat crude and kind of culturally unsophisticated. People seem to like him a lot, particularly women. He seems self-indulgent. He's sexually obsessed. He's keenly aware of his mortality, but he's impulsive. He does things, and he's always yearning. He's yearning for something more. And I think maybe it's in those respects that people sometimes can identify with him. But I mean, he is a polarizing figure, because there are people who can identify with aspects of his life, and others who are fiercely determined to resist him and don't like him at all, and are very angry about him, and somewhat angry about Updike even creating him. So it's I think all of that makes him such an interesting figure.
So in between some of those Rabbit novels, he wrote The Witches of Eastwick, which was made into a movie. I don't think he liked the screen version of it. But was Rabbit Angstrom ever taken to the screen? I don't recall that there was ever.
Actually, James Caan played Rabbit.
What was the title of that movie?
It's called Rabbit Run, and what was the line that Updike kind of kidded about? He said it wasn't released; it escaped. But I think it's yeah, no, it was a feature film. It was shot mostly in Reading. Came out, boy, I can't remember exactly, but it was probably around 1970. I think maybe one aspect that was problematic is that it was kind of filmed in the late 60s or around 1970, so it had that kind of late 60s feel to some of it, which was, this was really a 50s novel. So that there almost you feel a little disoriented for those who have read the novel when seeing the film. But there's aspects of it that are that are good and that are useful, but there's others that are not. But yeah, I think with Updike's I'm just trying to think of The Witches of Eastwick. I know his second wife at the time was very upset about it. I think Updike saw aspects of it that that he thought were done well, but certainly others. I think he felt like they had taken it to a new place. It wasn't really his novel in many respects. There's there's some of his short stories have been turned into good films. I think there was a cinematic adaptation of the Maple Stories with Blythe Danner and Michael Moriarty. that appeared probably in the late 70s that I thought was generally good. I know there continues to be talk of different Updike novels going to the screen, and I'm not sure where those efforts stand at present.
Hmm. So he also wrote a novel called Terrorists. This was after 9/11. My recollection, and check me on this, Jim, is that he wanted to write kind of a straight ahead commercial novel. It was kind of like, that's not what I do, but I'm going to do it with this one. Was that the case? Am I remembering this correctly? And what can you tell us about the book Terrorist?
Yeah, I don't, I don't, I guess I would put it that he was, given the events of 9/11, which he witnessed from his stepson's apartment roof in Brooklyn Heights. Um, I mean, there was a sense of what was going on in the world with terror, was of such heightened interest at the time that I think, and Updike had been a writer who had been trying to, as I said maybe before, chronicle American life. I think it was probably something that, on the one hand, maybe he felt like he couldn't resist, but I think he was all, as he got later into life, like a lot of writers, I think he was somebody who was right at the core and right, kind of tapping into the pulse of American culture in the 50s and the 60s and maybe into the 70s. But I think as he got older, I think, for all of us, we feel a little bit more outmoded or more out on the periphery. So perhaps it was a way in. It did turn out to be a novel that reached the bestseller list, which he hadn't been on, I guess, in a few years. And it was also a novel that had a tremendously polarized response. Some people praised it immensely, and others thought that he had gotten it wrong, and he'd gotten the terrorist, this kind of homegrown terrorist that he created was just really problematic. So yeah, so I think he was probably interested in again, with all of his last few novels of perhaps having lost some readers, of trying to get some readers back. But I think he was trying, he's a writer. We haven't really talked at all about religion, but he's a writer who was deeply interested not only in religion, but in theology, and used to review books on Barton, Tillich, and Kierkegaard for the New Yorker and other magazines. And he read a lot of theology in the early 60s to help him get through a kind of a personal crisis. So I think the idea that in terrorism, there's also a real kind of a confrontation with different religions that had been something that always interested him. And even at the end of his life, he was working on a novel about St. Paul that that he didn't get too far in. But I think the religion and religious yearning was something that deeply interested him.
What was his work regimen, Jim? I mean, was he a guy who got up in the morning and logged 4, 5, 6 hours? He traveled a lot, I believe. So um, I'm not sure that he's the kind of guy who needed to be in a particular place to be productive. But what do you know about his work routine?
Yeah, according to his family, that he liked to sleep late, and um that he was somebody who might not get uh to his writing till 9 or 9:30, and then, as he always described it, he would work until about a late lunch, till maybe 1 or 1:30. So there'd be 3 or 4 hours of writing in there. Um, and sometimes he warmed up by writing letters, first thing in the morning. But he generally wanted to get 3 pages of polished writing done a day, and as he said, sometimes he would get more and sometimes less. Um, but I think there were other times during he was doing a lot of reviewing, particularly from the mid 60s on. So he was often reading books and writing about books and reading proofs. And he was traveling over the country, giving readings and doing all sorts of things. It is a little bit remarkable, again, how he was so productive, because when you read about him, particularly when his children are young, he seems to be very available to them, and he's driving one to a music lesson, and he might be picking up sheep food for another one, and he's doing various chores, and he was also he was having affairs at the time, and he was he was very, very busy, and at times you wonder how did he get the writing done. But I think he seemed to, about 6 days a week, seem to have that idea of having a morning that maybe started a little later and one a little later, that would kind of produce the core of the writing.
So you mentioned, he's getting older. He gets to age about 75, 76. He got a lot of projects still ahead of him. He's excited about life, still energetic, apparently healthy. Then he gets a diagnosis of lung cancer, and not a whole lot of time to live. Was he a smoker? And he must have been having some kind of symptoms that took him to the doctor, and they said, hey, guess what? It's lung cancer. Um, was he a smoker, or was this just something that happened?
Yeah, he was a smoker earlier on, and I think there was talk of there was a little luncheonette, Stevens Luncheonette in Shillington, when he was a high school student, where they would go after school, and he would smoke cigarettes, and I think a lot of kids would smoke cigarettes. This would have been this would have been like 1949, 50 or so on, and then I think, yeah, he did smoke after that. I'm not sure when he stopped smoking, but in terms of the diagnosis, yeah, he had been on a book tour, or actually he had been over, I believe it was in Russia and maybe Eastern Europe, traveling, and then came back and was diagnosed with pneumonia. Um, and so that seemed to be the early symptoms. But then he ended up going on a book tour for the Widows of Eastwick on the West Coast, and was still suffering from what seemed to be pneumonia. And as I remember hearing from family that, during this would have been, kind of around Halloween and into November, he was kind of coughing some, and in a few letters that he's writing to people, he's in bed. And it wasn't until, I think, closer to Thanksgiving of that year, this would have been of 2008, that he was then diagnosed with, stage 4 lung cancer. But there really hadn't been, he's kind of misdiagnosed with pneumonia, and that they had missed this. And so by the time he got the diagnosis, he lived about 2 more months. Although he did continue to try and be productive, during that period, and he had multiple books that were ongoing. I think all of which he was able to finish, except for his novel about St. Paul. And then he also wrote some poems in the final 2 months of his life, almost kind of goodbye poems, that appear in the volume Endpoint, that I think are among some of his better poems. So yeah, so but he did die young. He died at 76, and seemed to have no indication, as he put it, through what porthole death will enter my body, until about 2 months before his death.
Yeah, it was sad. He very energetic and seemingly healthy guy, and all of a sudden stricken with
Mhm.
lung cancer. What is his, just in wrapping up, Jim, what do you think John Updike's place is in the annals of American fiction? How would you characterize that?
Yeah, well, and it's hard for me to say, because time takes us to different there's always surprises in terms of what becomes interesting to one generation, and and so on. But I do think that there was, I think Updike in many respects is very different from other American writers, because I think we have a history uh, in American literature of of writers, writing from the margins, from the outside, and whether it's whether it's Hemingway and Stein kind of writing as writing in Paris and having kind of exiled themselves, or whether it's other writers because of the color of their skin or their ethnicity or class who are writing from the margins, whether it's Frederick Douglass or Zora Neale Hurston, Toni Morrison. But you often have this history in American literature of outsiders. I mean, you have that with, I mentioned Thoreau before, or you could have that with Whitman, or you have it with Emily Dickinson, people writing from the margins as outsiders, kind of looking in. And I think Updike was a little bit different in that even though he was somebody who was kind of marginalized by, not having a lot economically as a kid, and really, they were really kind of pinching pennies and so on, that he ended up writing more from the center, and that he wasn't a writer who was trying to seek isolation or exile, and didn't feel marginalized. If anything, he kind of celebrated the country, and he tried to find a place near the center, and that was part of why he moved to Ipswich, from which he could write and observe. So I think he's somewhat unique among writers in that he's interested in middle class life, where a lot of writers would then be satirical of that kind of life. But he took it seriously. So I think it was important in that sense. But I think also just in the idea that he expressed himself so fully, probably more fully than any American writer since Henry James. And he gave a sense of, as he also put it, there's more history in my novels than in history books. So I think he gave, I think somebody 200 years from now thinking about what it was like to live in the second half of the 20th century could read particularly his rabbit novels, but other works by him, and really have a keen sense of a closely observed of world of that time. So and then I think it's also just his language, his facility with language, his visual sense, his sense for metaphor that for me those senses continue to resonate, and I presume they will for readers in the years ahead.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed. My guest has been James Schiff, and I didn't mention at the top, but he's a professor at the University of Cincinnati. He's a Bearcat, and also obviously has written extensively about John Updike, and an expert on the author. Jim, thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Mike. It's been a pleasure talking to you.